Campaign for Liberty, Baltimore County, is pleased to host Dr. James DiLorenzo as keynote speaker.
But anyway, so it didn't work then, but the fable is Roosevelt got us out of the Great Depression. He didn't. Unemployment was still 15%. And then the lie was spread even further by saying, well, World War II got us out of the Great Depression. Well, no, it didn't. At the time the United States entered World War II, the number of unemployed Americans was about 5.5 million. 11 million men were drafted into the military, okay, and several million more joined because they knew that if you joined, you were much less likely to be in the infantry. And so you could consider the effect of conscription to be maybe 12, 13 million men. So unemployment did disappear, but it didn't disappear because of prosperity. And you got 5.5 million unemployed, and you have 12 or 13 million people essentially conscripted into the army. We could end unemployment today if we conscripted every single unemployed person and sent them to Afghanistan. That'd do the trick. I'd start with Congress and send them all over there. They all like going on these junkets where they go over there and eat gourmet food for a day and come back and declare themselves experts on Afghanistan. So the second big lie that's been told by the economics profession, Paul Krugman does it every time, and he has a column in the New York Times, is that World War II ended the Great Depression. It didn't. The average American was worse off during World War II because there was rationing. There was a massive transfer of resources away from the consumer economy to the wartime economy, and so the standard of living of the average American went down during the war years, not up. And then there's a third big lie that was told about this, and the big lie is told by just ignoring an astounding fact that totally contradicts Keynes's theory that government spending can stimulate the economy. And the astounding fact is that the year 1946 is the most vigorous year of economic growth in all of American history. The private sector of the economy grew by about 30% in 1 year, 1946. Okay, and then what else was happening in 1946? It was the demobilization of the Army. The federal budget went from roughly about $95 billion in 1945, the last year of World War II, to $35 billion in 1947. A two-thirds reduction in absolute dollars of the federal budget was underway, and as a result, 1946 was the biggest year in American history for economic growth. In several hundred years plus of our history, it was the biggest year. Who has ever heard of that? In fact, the economics profession usually lies about it because they calculate GDP by counting government in there. And of course, they subtract the $65 billion from GDP that was government withdrawing. But the real job creation activity is from the private sector. It's not the government. But if you want to look at private consumption spending and private investment spending, or the real economy, it grew by about 30% during that time. And of course, that flatly contradicts the Keynesian theory that government spending, whether you call it stimulus or whether you call it bananas or coconuts, whatever you want to call it, can create jobs. It doesn't. And I guess one of the famous lines in the Henry Hazlitt book is it was a popularization actually of the writings by a French economic journalist of the mid-19th century named Friedrich Bastiat. And he wrote a famous essay called What is Seen versus What is Unseen. And what is unseen is when the government taxes us, and what is unseen is the jobs that are destroyed, the jobs that are never created because of the tax dollars. What is seen, though, is the guys working, emptying out the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C., the people that I cuss at every day when I go around the Beltway with all the barrels and everything like that, and they're digging up the highways and repaving them again, digging them up and repaving them again. And so that's what's seen. So jobs are being created. So you can see the jobs that are being created, and the people that have those jobs will thank the politicians. They'll send them money. They'll make their wife or their husband or their adult children vote for the politician. But what is not seen is all the jobs that are destroyed by that. If you read Economics in One Lesson now, or study economics for about 5 minutes, you'll understand this. That's why politicians always like this, because it's a way of buying votes with taxpayer dollars to support their careers and their income and their wealth and their connections. And they use this smokescreen of academic respectability to cover the whole thing up. But like I said, it never did work. And it really does work for politicians, though. It really does work for politicians. For example, there's another great book. I doubt if you have this one over there. It's called The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn. John T. Flynn was a journalist who was one of the preeminent critics of Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. And in his book, he cited a Senate report. It's called the Official Report of the U.S. Senate on Campaign Expenditures. And it looked at Works Progress Administration employees, the people who had government make-work jobs during the Great Depression. And he said this, WPA employees were told that they could only keep their government jobs if they were registered to vote as Democrats. Scores of them were fired for not registering as Democrats. They were required to take a pledge to vote for congressional Democrats as a condition of employment, and were instructed to donate 2% of their salaries to the Roosevelt re-election campaign if they wanted to keep their jobs. So it was pretty blatant right there. Somebody from Chicago must have been involved in that. In Oregon, running that thing. Chicago or New Orleans, one or the other. The economists have been studying this for a long time. There was an economic historian named Gavin Wright who studied New Deal spending, and he said this: WPA, Works Progress Administration, employment reached peaks in the fall of election years, and the pattern is most pronounced when employment is measured relative to indices of need. And so, and this is what economists call the political business cycle. And all politicians do this. They always rev up spending in the sort of the 6 months to a year before the next election, because most voters forget what happened before that. But we're sort of short memories when it comes to politics. We spend most of our time thinking about how to pay the bills, how to get through school, how to do our jobs, raise families. In politics, when the election comes around, we start thinking about it, and the politicians know this. And there's another book on this by an old friend of mine named Bill Shugart and a co-author named Jim Couch. It's called The Political Economy of the New Deal. And what they document in this book is that the lion's share of New Deal stimulus spending, which, by the way, was dwarfed by Herbert Hoover's stimulus spending. Herbert Hoover's deficit, his was 13% of the whole budget, the equivalent of that, which is more than twice as big as the Bush-Obama stimulus spending as a proportion of the whole ball of wax. And so here's what Shugart and Couch say in their book. They said the lion's share of New Deal spending did not go to the most economically depressed states like Mississippi, which was probably the worst part of America during the Great Depression, the Mississippi Delta. Didn't get much money there because, of course, the whole South really didn't vote Republican until Ronald Reagan came along, because it was the party of Lincoln. And so the whole South was solid Democrat. Why would you waste money down there if you're running for re-election during the Great Depression? You've thrown it away. But where did they spend the money? They sent it, quote, in California and other western states where the Depression was less severe, but FDR's 1932 electoral victory margins were the slimmest. So where he had the slim electoral margins, that's where he spent the big money there, regardless of need or poverty or anything like that. And of course it worked. He got elected and reelected and reelected. And some of the other things they found are states with healthier economies received proportionally more federal aid in the form of New Deal grants that they were not expected to repay, while repayable loans were directed in slightly greater amounts to their harder hit states. New Dealers allocated significantly more funds to states where the nation's most valuable farms were located, whereas the poor sharecroppers of the Mississippi Delta got nothing. In fact, they were really worked over because the first New Deal, where they really revved up the programs of paying farmers to not raise crops or acreage allotments. Now, the sharecroppers ran the farms, and a lot of these were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of slaves in Mississippi. And so here's the government saying you can only grow 50% of what you grew last year. Well, if that's the dictate, you don't need as many farm workers. You don't need as many sharecroppers to be in business, and they drove them out of business. So so a lot of these people ended up trying to go to the cities to find jobs, and they made the unemployment problem in the cities even worse as a result of that. And then Shugart and Couch say the states that gave Roosevelt larger percentage of the popular vote in 32 were also rewarded with significantly more federal aid than less supportive constituencies. So it always has been a vote-buying scheme, and it's all covered up by the Paul Krugmans of the world, who of course are the court historians. If you want to understand in great depth how this works, I'd recommend an essay by Murray Rothbard entitled "The Nature of the State." It's online. There's another one called "Anatomy of the State" by Rothbard, and he was an old personal friend of Ron Paul's. Rothbard was the co-founder of the Mises Institute, and Ron Paul was on the board at the time. He was one of the original board members of the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. And so, and here's a surprising conclusion from this book by William Shugart and Jim Couch. They say the New Deal failed as a matter of economic policy, but was successful in building a winning political coalition. FDR was reelected overwhelmingly in 36 and again in 40, in part due to the support of the big city machines, organized labor, and other constituencies, which benefited disproportionately from New Deal largesse. And that, of course, is why the original Obama stimulus bill made it so that most of the money was targeted to be spent during the election year of 2010. That's the way it was written. Even though it was supposedly an emergency in 2008, in 2009, it's an emergency, the Great Recession. We need to put people back to work. He said, well, let's wait a while before we spend any of this money. And I was at the Florida straw poll a couple of weeks ago, and Ron Paul was there, but he had to leave before the final vote to go give a speech somewhere else. And a man named Mark Cross is the head of the Florida Campaign for Liberty organization, and he gave the surrogate speech for Ron Paul, the final sales pitch for votes, and the other ones did too, but the whole place was still laughing at that point. By I think during the debate, he actually had a debate. I forget which one of the candidates said it. It might have been Johnson or something like that. People were still chuckling over this 2 days later, where he said that my neighbor's 2 dogs have created more shovel-ready projects than Obama has. That's pretty much that's sort of well, that's by design. They designed it so that they would have a big explosion of government pork barrel spending right before the 2010 election, and that's what this is. This jobs bill, pass my jobs